All right, my name is David Duffield. I am the historian for the Colorado LGBTQ History Project at the Center on Colfax in Denver, Colorado. I have the extraordinary pleasure of interviewing Meredith Talusan as part of the Queer Author Expo series for Pride 2020. While Pride has been canceled in physical form because of COVID-19, we stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We believe that it is important to make all of our voices heard, but most importantly, to recognize the systemic and oppressive and generational racism in our communities. With that, I have the pleasure of introducing Meredith. Meredith, thank you so much for this interview. It's an extraordinary pleasure to speak with you.
Hi, it's wonderful to speak to you too, and it's great that you're foregrounding what's going on right now. Which has a lot of relevance to to the work that I do and the book that I wrote.
So your memoir is titled Fairest, which seems like a natural jumping off point into sort of what was the significance of the title?
Well, I mean, I am a Filipino albino trans woman, and I think fairest. And for me, one of the two narratives that I was really interested in talking about is the way in which my history of white passing, my history of people perceiving me as white, even though I don't have any European blood, led to me thinking about my gender and questioning my relationship with my gender and eventually transitioning, right? And fairest is a word that encapsulates both of those ideas, and actually like an extremely, since we're talking about it, like a very racist white supremacist word, right? That
Right.
equates beauty with fairness. And then I'm also really interested in what it means to be fair, both to other people and to society at large, right? That's also like one of the large concerns of the book. So I was really happy to be able to find a word that encapsulates all of that. Yeah, so that's the significance of the title.
Wonderful, thank you. Tell me a little bit about then what you want folks to take away from this memoir.
I think everybody who has talked to me about the book, and it's been really great that it's been out for a couple of weeks, and whether it be like formal interviews or reading reviews or people talk, like writing me about it, is that everybody I think enters the book from a different place, and gets different things out of the book, right? That it's a book about my immigrant story coming from a rural area of the Philippines, coming to the States. It's a story about, like what it means to pass and what it means to navigate these, elite circles, because I ended up going to Harvard for undergrad as somebody who comes from a minority background. It's about, the difficult history of colonialism, and Eurocentrism, both in the Philippines and United States. And then it also leads to all of the questions about like what it means for somebody who has, who has a different gender and or sexuality, because I spend most of, like a good part of the book narrating my life as a gay man, and how that impacts your life, especially when you have other minority identities. But the thing that I've been, just really, I mean, I've been surprised, but also just really pleased, is that everybody I think who encounters the book has something to get from it and has been communicating all of these, kind of like wonderful resonances that, that I hadn't really even thought about before.
So multiple identities within multiple different takeaways and multiple experiences. So in a lot of ways, an infinite experience in the human experience. I feel like this book spoke to me most with the idea of self-love. There's a
Mm.
transcendent moment when you I think it's chapter 16 when we were just talking about walking across the floor and sort of realizing that this is sort of who you felt you are, you know? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that from the very, very beginning of my memories, being able to accept and love myself has been a really key feature of my life, just because when you grow up as an albino person, the only, like the only one of your kind, especially in the Philippines, right? And, like when you are, when people try to bully you, or when people try to harass you or call you names, like the only, like the only way in which I can really counter that depiction or that narrative of me for myself is to be able to appreciate the aspects of myself that I love, right? And I think, and also, like one of the other thing that we haven't talked about is that I was a child star in
Right.
the Philippines. And so one of the things that I learned very early in my, like as a very, very young child, was that if you're in a position where you're vulnerable to other people, like you can't, like you can't show it. Like you have to just like work through and perform and, and like believe and pretend that you're in control. And, and that maybe that pretending will become being, right? And the scene that you were talking about is the scene where I dressed up as a woman, really, for the first time,
Right.
at least as somebody who wants to be seen as a woman rather than in drag. And I remember feeling as soon as I walked in, and it was this like big cocktail reception at a, like at a museum. I just suddenly felt myself seize up and feel like, oh, like I'm overdressed. People know that I'm a man, like this is awful, like people will, but then I was just like, you're here, like you have to, you have to be able to appreciate the parts of yourself that you've learned are good, and that, and that you have to, like you have to work through that situation with as much grace as you can. And like it actually worked out okay. So yeah.
You manifested something that you felt, it's like,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that that's been a really important part of my life, right? Has been to, to be able to sort of like try to actualize what is in your imagination, right?
right.
Including, like including being a published author who is talking to you now, right? Like that,
Right.
like who would have imagined that, like my in all of my little immigrant kid fantasies, like looking among the rice paddies, it was not part of my fantasy as a child to ever like write or publish a book. Like I just wouldn't have thought of that as something that I could attain, which is really funny because I wanted to be an astronaut. Like somehow, like being an astronaut was more attainable to me than writing a whole book in English, right?
Right.
My first language is in English.
It's
So
Tagalog.
exactly, exactly.
So I'm curious, like we talked about this metaphor of, if that's the appropriate word, but the idea of the mirror in the book, and that is a metaphor for how someone can become powerful, or well, it's a font of power, I believe. Is that appropriate to say?
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest that I was a little bit hesitant about, kind of like using the mirror because it's such a well used metaphor in order to describe, like in order to describe both trans experience and experiences of transformation, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, at least, like that has been true, that looking in the mirror has allowed me to imagine worlds that didn't exist before. So I think rather than thinking of it as vanity, I think of it as self-reflection, right?
Right.
And the other aspect of that is that I think of the mirror as a bridge. Like those two metaphors
Right.
exist side by side in the book. That the mirror is a way for me to find a path towards towards the worlds that I'm seeking. Right, like whether it's earlier in my life, where I was manifesting that as like, okay, like I can be American or I can be a woman, to these days when I look in the mirror and say, like how can you be a better person working towards a more just world, like that, like that also is something that I do, is look in the mirror and imagine how I can make the world better for myself and for other people.
That's amazing. Thank you. Tell me, there was also a piece in there about the makeup in the mirror, about how, because that seems to be a big signifier, to coin an existentialist term. It's
Mm-hmm.
like that, and I read a lot of existentialism, I guess, that comes from queer theory when you were studying at Harvard as well. But it permeates this memoir. The idea of makeup being sort of a presentation of part of who you are, a bridge in a way.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting just because it's a really fraught discussion in the trans community because of the fact that so much of so many depictions of us in media shows us in a mirror wearing makeup. But
Right,
I realized as I was writing the book that the problem isn't actually with makeup or the mirror itself, because it is kind of, in many ways, it's a necessary part of the process for so many trans women, I think, including me. But the problem is more that media tends to only focus on that part of our lives, right?
right,
And
right.
so by the time that you get to the part where I'm discussing learning how to use makeup, learning how, like makeup can make me more beautiful, you've gone with me through this entire period of understanding, what the rest of my life had been like up to that point. And so, and what's been really, and also, like, I've been able to write about the fact that I now don't use makeup on a regular basis. I'm not wearing makeup now, right? And it's like, and I'm not any less or more of a woman because I'm not wearing makeup. But there was a period of time when I needed that security blanket in order to
Okay,
feel like, in order to be able to access my womanhood. Right?
okay. That's amazing. Thank you. Tell me then, like, because the memoir speaks to multiple identities, we follow you from childhood growing up, and is it, forgive me, Bakalan in
Bakla.
Bakla in the Philippines, which is in the
Mhm.
northern part,
It's bakla, yeah, in Tagalog.
and
It's
Tagalog.
there's bading, there are different words in different languages, yeah,
Right.
to
And then
describe for gender people.
you talk about growing up around different family members and your mother and your father and your grandma, and then being a star in the Philippines in the early, or was it the mid 1980s then?
Yeah, it was like around 19, I'm trying to think, 1983, 84, so yeah, so the mid 80s, I guess, yeah.
Wonderful. And then you talk about emigrating to the United States, and it's kind of it's really like it sounds like it was very difficult, but because you talk about your mother and your father living separately, as well as like going to live with your uncle in California and growing up in I guess it was termed a more conservative part of California. But what was
Right.
that experience like as a youth? How would you communicate it?
I mean, I would just say that one of the really consistent things about the memoir is that, and one of the reasons why I love memoir, is that it doesn't follow the sort of neat path, right? And it
Right,
was really important for me to be able to depict that, right? That
right,
my grandmother, for instance, who raised me, was a really inspirational figure in my life, did, like, love me unconditionally, did so many good things for me. But at the same time, part of the reason why she did that was because she perceived me as more beautiful because I was white, right? Because she
right,
was brainwashed by colonialism, right? Or my mom, who was, like, who was pretty terrible to me when I was growing up. Like, I experienced physical abuse from her. I was neglected, and like, and in high school, I experienced periods of abandonment. At the same time, it was also really important for me to narrate the fact that she didn't want to have me and was forced to have me because abortion in the Philippines was illegal. Divorce is illegal, so she was forced to get married. So there were all of these factors that led to her not really feeling a sense of responsibility to me as her child, right? And I think consistently one of the things about it, I feel like being like being an intersectional memoir, because of the fact that it has that central complication, that it's not just about one thing, then it left me room to make everything else, like as complicated as it actually was, while at the same time it not feeling like, at least I hope, that it doesn't feel overwhelming to the reader, that the complications make sense in terms of the structure of the book.
I feel like they make a lot of sense. The memoir flowed very, very naturally for me as a reader. I was able to, I mean, I couldn't put it down, to be honest with you. I was at a point where I was wondering, like, there are these exceptionally vulnerable moments when you're
Mhm.
talking about your grandmother, but also the reasons why people do things and the motivations behind them as well. And then, if you'll pardon me if it's inappropriate to bring up, but there's this section at the very end where you talk about her funeral, but which is sporadic throughout. But she uses the past tense when speaking about
Mhm.
love. And
Yeah.
it just it crushes you to feel that. Here is this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, yeah. Like when my grandmother and I experienced a real rough patch when I first transitioned, just because she didn't understand what it meant, because in the Philippines, there are third gender people, but it didn't really make sense for her worldview that I would change my name, that I would have surgery, like that wasn't really part of how she imagined me, right? And so,
Right.
in one of those early conversations, she did say, "I loved you so much" in the past tense, and that was really really difficult. And it's something that I think a lot of immigrants experience, is that you have these figures from back home who are so important in your life, and then they encourage you to move to the States, but then when you grow up they don't understand you, or you don't understand each other. Like, at least I maintain my Tagalog. I have two younger half sisters who like who came when they were like 6 and 5, and they can't even communicate with like with the people from back home, right?
Right.
Like those are some of the small and big heartbreaks that we experience, not like for me as an immigrant, but then on top of that as somebody who eventually transitioned and has to communicate what that means to people who have just like no frame of reference for it. But the good thing is that she eventually understood, and she became the person who corrected people whenever they used my old name, and was like super super like vigilant about that. So yeah, so thankfully she adjusted, and she came to love me again in the present tense. She unfortunately died in 2015, but that's still, at least, like we came to that place before she did.
I'm so happy to hear that. The love of a parent and a grandparent is so very, very important. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask if it's okay to talk about the idea of the duality of going between sort of multiple worlds, right? So you say in the memoir that you're read as passing as a white woman, and there's privileges along with that, and yet your experiences teach many, many different things about that. Can you maybe comment on sort of what does the seeing the world in both perspectives perhaps look like, if that's such a thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really ongoing, like that's a really ongoing conversation and negotiation for me. And the thing that I talk about a lot is the fact that there are a fair number of white passing people in the States and in the world, but I think what's unique about my experience is that I'm white passing, but I have zero European blood, right?
Right.
So usually people who are white passing have some European blood, but also I come from another country, so my sort of like fundamental, my early childhood influences, I came relatively late. I came when I was 15. And
Right.
so for me, the experience of that, of being perceived as white while internally experiencing myself as a very different person, is that I'm constantly confronted these um, with these contradictions, right? And that
Right.
was something that I experienced a lot, during, because this is a time of reckoning for everybody in this country, regardless of race. But one of the things that I really experienced was this sort of way in which I was experiencing the difficulties and the tensions and the struggles of both white people and non-white people, while also at the same time, like not having the actual experiences of either of those groups, right? So
Right.
it's sort of, it's being in that liminal space where you both have access to both experiences, and at the same time your experience isn't exactly the same as those people, right? And that's something that I've been trying to confront for myself and query, and also, they can also use for good. Like, one of the things that I've been really trying to do is be really open, like about the ways in which I've been complicit in anti-Blackness, the ways in which the unconscious biases that I've had, like I just talked on Twitter today about the fact that I didn't even think about, arranging book events with Black or even POC owned bookstores. Like, that just didn't enter my consciousness, right? And certainly, like certainly in the future, that's going to be, that's going to be a really important priority for me.
I feel like the existentialism might offer some perspective here because it talks about what is more often not said reveals a lot more about what is said. Lacan, no? And so the idea is that when we look at really what is understated, and when we look at racism in America, there's a great deal of ignorance, that's not being talked
Right.
about, that white people really don't understand what it is like to be a person of color or an African American or any different, right?
Right. Well, I think a lot of white people are afraid of, of sort of like divulging things that they've done that are racist, because they're afraid of how they're going to look, or how, of being confronted, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that it's really important for white people to just think about, well, yes, like that will impact your life possibly negatively, but think about the impact of racism on, on Black people and other people of color, and compare the disturbance of communicating how you've behaved in racist ways in the past to, to the ways in which Black people in this country's lives have been so affected by racism, to the point where, where they don't feel safe, like being out in public, right?
Right.
I have a number of Black trans friends, like, who just don't go out in public alone,
Right.
or, like, or if they do, they have to spend time and money, like either hiring a car in New York, because they just don't feel safe,
Right.
in any kind of like public place, right? Um,
It's the idea of coming from the Philippines with the genocide that the United States committed during the Philippine-American War and the betrayals and the colonization, and not just
right,
that, but the history. Even though the Philippines is one of the most diverse places on earth, I mean, you have emigrations from all over the world, an ancient history, and a beautiful language, higher levels of education throughout most of the 19th century, and and rooted in Catholicism. And so, and
right,
you can have a racial caste system as well. But from these experiences coming to the United States, um, you look at the American way of being transgendered or being gendered differently, and there's a lot of different aspects to it, from medicalization,
right.
and the fact that that doesn't exist in other cultures says a lot about how the United States assigns identity. But what can we say in these last few minutes is, you know, to reinscribe and not erase trans bodies from space may be one of the most radical ways to look at creating space for ourselves and maybe fighting oppression, but also just reinscribing people into the world, and being is an act of resistance to erasure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the really important things is that trans people have existed, as far as we know, like from the early, like from the time that human beings like recorded the existence of people, right?
Right.
And that medicalization, the form that we take now may not have existed before, but the fact of the matter is that in Filipino indigenous society, trans people were, like trans people held high places in society. We were allowed to marry just like, you know, a class of people called babaylan were allowed to marry like women and had all of the privileges of marriage, et cetera, right? And that, that consciousness also, like, is also prevalent in a lot of indigenous cultures, including a lot of native cultures. And so I think it's really important, like, first of all, to like acknowledge and affirm that, but then also that there isn't anything inherently inferior about being trans, right? Like, I love being trans. I love having had the perspectives that I've had. I love being able to look at any situation and be able to viscerally imagine myself in the genders that I've been in, which is an experience that cis people don't have. And that's something that I really value. And so if there's anything, like that I want to communicate both about the book and about my life, is that, there's no reason to in any way feel like transness is alternative or transness is like a form of difference that is in any way inferior to being cisgender, right?
Meredith, thank you. That's extraordinary and beautiful. I appreciate it. Is there a section of the memoir which you would like to read?
Yes, I figured I would just start from the first chapter. There is a prologue before, but I like reminiscing about my childhood. So I'm just gonna read the very first section of the first chapter. Oh, and I'm reading from an iPad, even though I have the book in front of me because I'm albino and I have bad vision. So and I get nervous when I read, so I skip over words if the font is too small. Okay, Chapter 1. Among my people, it is a widely held belief that an infant would become whatever its mother had craved. Sugar, and a child would turn out sweet, for instance, or plantains, and the baby would grow sturdy. Pregnant women were therefore advised not to spend too much time in the sun, and certainly not to stare at it directly, for fear that their baby would be born anak araw, a sunchild, the strangest creature whose skin was so pale it glowed, and wouldn't open its eyes except to squint, destined to be nearly blind, an affront against nature. Yet on the long bus ride from my parents' house in Manila to my hometown of Talaksan in the province of Bulacan, my grandmother, Nanay Coro, told me that as soon as she held me in her arms, she was sure I was a blessing. She refused to allow anyone to talk about me any other way, especially because I was destined to live in America, the richest of countries, where Mama's father, Lola Bert, had settled, full of people who looked like me. And anyway, I wasn't like other anak araw. My mother stayed away from the sun when she was pregnant, but craved sweet corn, and so that was how I must have ended up with corn silk hair and fair skin. Though I did burn in the sun, I wasn't near blind like I was supposed to be, only nearsighted, which was lucky since I wouldn't have known what to do with myself if I couldn't read. As our bus sped across the highway through an endless series of rice paddies, which I perceived as patches of yellowish brown since it was April and the fields had been harvested, my grandmother assured me that I was meant for a better future than her and our ancestors, farmers who had tilled soil in the fields surrounding our village for generations. This is because you are fair and beautiful, she said, not dark and ugly like me. I learned not to protest because I'd heard similar words many times before, not just from her, but from other relatives and neighbors in Talusan, where I lived until I was 3. I'd spent the last 3 years going to school in Manila and only making weekend visits back to the place I still considered home. But after my grandmother discovered that Mama had been locking me in my bedroom to go out after I fell asleep, and having learned that a distant cousin had died in a fire in the middle of the night, she insisted that I return to Talusan and wait another year to start first grade with other kids my age. There are people in Manila who think I look abnormal, I said. They're just jealous they don't have a child like you. I looked forward to living in Talusan again, where no one found me strange. We eventually got to the bus station in Baliwag, the closest city to our municipality, where Nanay and I walked to the jeepney stand for our town. There were no jeepneys when we got there, which meant that it would be at least a 30-minute wait. So Nanay Cora decided to stop by the dry market to get some supplies. On our way, we passed by a store that sold cassettes, and I asked my grandmother if she would buy me one. Papa owned cassettes back in Manila, but I'd never had one of my own. We came in from the afternoon light, and I blinked as my eyes adjusted to the darkness of that tiny stall, where a woman sat over a glass cabinet filled with cassettes. We were in a hurry, as Nanay Cora asked the store owner to suggest a tape for me to buy. The woman contemplated for a moment, then opened the cabinet to pull out a cassette titled Small Voice, with a picture of a girl in pigtails named Lea Salonga. She's not as white as you, but her voice is beautiful, the woman said. And I will just leave it at that. Lea Salonga was my first girl role model, and she has since become, like a big Broadway actress and is the voice of Mulan and Jasmine. And so you can, if you want to find out what happens next, come get the book.
Wonderful. Meredith, it has been an extraordinary pleasure of my life to interview with you. Thank you so much.
It was wonderful talking to you too.
Wonderful. I'm going to stop real quick.